what do you think the importance of this video will have? Let's just say, hypothetically, if Brian Laundrie is connected to this crime, if he is apprehended, and there is a prosecution, what significance will this video have ultimately during that prosecution, and if and when there is a trial?
Imran, it's going to be huge. You are seeing with your own eyes a history of violence between Brian and Gabby. I mean, there's really no substitute for. So the prosecutions, they're going to file their motion to get this admitted as a prior bad act. There's apparently other instances of violence or at the restaurant there in Wyoming. So, and then these are things that jurors are going to love to see because it's going to dirty up Brian Laundrie and make them not like him. I already think it's a very strong and compelling case for the prosecution, but this is something that will just put him over the edge. I mean, seeing a woman like that, frazzled, upset, clearly the victim of domestic violence, that's not what you want to have if you're a criminal defense attorney at all. Now, certainly he has a right to lawyer up and he has a Fifth Amendment constitutional privilege. You know, prosecutors can't use that at trial. But we, as the public and law enforcement, can certainly say, hey, if you're worried about your missing fiance, do you call the police or do you call your lawyer in New York? Well, guess what Brian Laundrie did? He called his lawyer in New York. Was he helpful at all in searching for her, giving information? Absolutely not. And let me tell you what is admissible. Flight in every state is admissible as consciousness of guilt. And we have someone that has taken off. He is nowhere to be found. Who knows if his parents helped him or not? Again, we're really kind of trying to draw conclusions from limited evidence here. But ultimately, that flight and that video points a very damning picture of Brian Laundrie right now.
This comparison with Martin Luther King, do you think that it could somehow work against the defense and tick off the jury? Martin Luther King is a sacred figure in our history in this country. And I would be very cautious if I was the defense in making that comparison, especially after this evidence that has come forward through this trial. And not just this trial, but generally against R. Kelly, even in his past, and some of the charges that he has faced in the past. Do you think that this strategy of this comparison could backfire against the defense as this jury listens to these closing arguments?
Imran, I'm a former federal prosecutor, so obviously I have my bias here. I'm going to be in favor of my former colleagues there in Brooklyn, but this has been a very poor job by R. Kelly's defense team from the jump. I mean, and I've been critical of them. You know, let's start with the opening statement where Judge Donnelly, herself objected many times, where R. Kelly's attorney said, ladies and gentlemen, more than 100 times. I mean, she lost the jury right then and there. But let's talk about this week. After 6 weeks of prosecution witnesses, 45 in total, 11 victims, it's the defense's turn. And they don't have their witnesses ready. They have 2 on Monday. They waste the court's time. They waste the jurors' time and the court staff. They have another 2 on Wednesday. And again, these are full court days in federal court. And then they wrap up with their 5th and final witness yesterday. All men, all of whom work for R. Kelly, not really compelling testimony. I didn't hear from any former girlfriends or lovers who said that R. Kelly didn't engage in this type of conduct. So, and now you have this closing, the last opportunity to reach these jurors, and you're making these really outlandish comparisons between someone who is an accused sex abuser and a civil rights icon. Not going to work. I wouldn't be surprised if we get a verdict as early as tomorrow. We like to play armchair quarterback here, but, I was really baffled at this defense strategy from the gate. You brought on attorneys that have no federal criminal trial experience. You have, these witnesses that, really aren't ready, aren't really powerful. Even the cross-examination was overly aggressive, questioning the parents of these victims and blaming them for putting in the situation. So again, I'm really scratching my head. Maybe they're going for some sort of Hail Mary, hoping you can get 1, maybe 2 jurors to hang this panel. It's obviously hard to convict celebrities in this country, but ultimately, I think it was a very poor strategy, ineffective, not planned out, and really, I just do not know why R. Kelly's high-priced defense team took the route that they
bring
did.
some that mental state of mind into the trial on the defense. How can they do that? Do we expect to hear from a forensic psychiatrist on the defense to perhaps explain away some of this behavior?
Imran, I'm not a doctor, but I'm happy to play one on TV. And it's tough in these cases. We're dealing with it right now with Lori Daybell. She's at least temporarily unfit to stand trial, but we don't have access to all the psych records and so forth. But I can tell you what I see, and what I see is someone who is not well. I can't imagine going to trial with Kessler as a client. She's going to be screaming at her attorney, the jurors. It's going to be one disruption after another. So, and I'm also relying on what law enforcement in the jails are reporting. I mean, we talked about R. Kelly and the feces in that trial, but apparently her cell is covered in feces. She's telling folks that her mom worships Satan. She wants to be in the general population. Obviously, she can, so the other inmates can kill her. This does not seem like a woman who is fit to stand trial. Again, unless she's a great Hollywood actress and belongs here in my hometown of Los Angeles. So I just don't see any way, with the way she is right now, that you can defend this case if you're Kessler.
Animosity between these two brothers as to this individual because he's a Mennonite. What do you make of this, and how important will that text exchange be during the course of this trial?
Very important, Imran, because as a prosecutor, you always want to tell a story. And in a murder case, you want to hit motive, means, and opportunity. That motive is there. You think the brother, who's a law enforcement officer, would know better. But the other brother ended up pleading to obstruction accessory after the fact charges, essentially for getting the murder weapon afterwards. So you got your motive, you got your means. That cell phone evidence is very powerful. They're traveling together, both Krause and Gucci's cell phone, the murderer and the victim, and the opportunity, of course. You have a former Air Force personnel that could certainly be more than capable of committing this murder. So I like this case for the prosecution. I think it should have been, and this is something that I've been critical of the Department of Justice for. You have these federal hate crime statutes that are rarely used. We thought it would change when we had a new administration and a new Attorney General Garland, but we're not seeing it used enough. Imran, I think it does. That timeline is really important in a case like this. Obviously, these are two individuals who are traveling across the country, made many, many stops. So ultimately, when was Gabby murdered? Where was she murdered? Where was her body dumped? Well, we know the answer to the last question, but that's why the first thing that law enforcement did is, they got a search warrant for the EDR. That's something that vehicles have nowadays, that computer, and that says a lot and gives law enforcement a lot of information, as well as cell site data, of course. So I think that's what the FBI, which is taking the lead on this case, is going to use to really sort of create that timeline to show when Gabby fell off the grid and when she was killed, and ultimately when her body was disposed of.
Yeah, Neama, I was actually going to ask you, what do you think they're doing in terms of all this information? Because you have these pieces of information which tend to allow law enforcement to make that timeline. But what do you make of law enforcement relying on the public at large and these videos that are taken likely on dash cams or cell phones? And it's really indicative of the new age of investigation in law enforcement. What do you think this role is going to have in this case, including the search for Brian Laundrie?
Imran, I know there's a lot of criticism. Obviously, this is a very sad case, Gabby Petito, but there are thousands of missing people in the country, and folks have been asking, well, what's special about Gabby Petito? Is she a young white woman, a blonde woman? Is that why the public has so much interest in this case, unlike the others? But from a law enforcement perspective, I mean, this is very helpful when you have the nation, looking for someone, in this case, Brian Laundrie, or you have a YouTuber that, you can get a lot of tips. Obviously, you're going to get a lot of bad tips. You got to sort through all that. Some of them are just conspiracy theories or garbage, but you're going to get some good nuggets in there. So the fact that the nation is following this case so closely certainly does help law enforcement.
As a former prosecutor, what are you looking for in that van, or what are you hoping that investigators are going to find in order to tie whoever, let's just say hypothetically for this question, that it's Brian Laundrie, who allegedly committed this crime? What are you looking for to tie him to this murder within that van?
Well, Imran, Joe's one of the best, so I'm glad to have his expertise on a case like this. And he nailed it. I mean, you want something in this van, right? You want blood, you want a murder weapon, you want some sort of direct evidence that ties Laundrie to Gabby's murder. And I know the FBI team has probably gone through that, every inch of that van, with with their experts. It's like CSI. This is what we watch on TV, and the jurors are going to absolutely love that. You have to be an amazing criminal mastermind to be able to cover up your tracks like this. And I don't think Brian Laundrie is that guy. Ultimately, whether he actually is in the preserve or not, or his family and sort of concocted this story with their family attorney to give him a 10-day head start so he can flee the jurisdiction. I mean, it's too soon to tell, but I do expect that once additional facts and evidence come out, there will be some evidence in that van or in the EDR, the computer, that's going to tie Brian Laundrie to his fiance's disappearance. Because frankly, it doesn't make sense. When you go on a trip, you come back without your fiance, you don't call your lawyer, you call the police. So.
Yeah, Neama, I actually want to talk to you about that. That's an interesting point because he gets back, he lawyers up. There's this lag time. He's not cooperating with law enforcement. His family are involved. His parents are involved. And now he's gone missing. Again, with that possible head start to get wherever he's gone, wherever he had to get, ever had to go. Or there is the possibility that he's not even here with us on this planet anymore. That's also a possibility. We don't know yet. But let's just assume that he has been on the run, he escapes, and he's nowhere to be found. Do his parents face any sort of criminal liability, criminal charges for possibly assisting in his escape?
No question, Imran. Yeah, as far as Brian is concerned, he's either been killed himself, or is a fugitive. And if he's a fugitive, there's so much attention on this case, I think eventually he will be found. Now, as far as his parents, his parents are telling law enforcement that he is in this preserve, hundreds of thousands of square feet. And law enforcement has been searching it. They've sent dive teams and so forth. Well, if mom and dad sent law enforcement on a wild goose chase, there's really one of two things. Either their son Brian lied to them, in which case there wouldn't be any liability. They're just reporting what had been told them. Or if they're actually covering up, no question they can be charged with obstruction of justice or even accessories after the fact to Gabby's murder.
Yeah, do you think that law enforcement are interviewing his parents with that mindset, with that lens? It's one thing to interview these parents, the family, for someone who is missing. It's one to interview the parents, the family, for someone who is a suspect, and then you're questioning them if they helped that suspect escape. What do you think's going on in terms of their interviews with the parents, meaning law enforcement?
Well, I know they've said Brian Laundrie is a person of interest, but let's not mince words. I mean, he's a suspect now. There's no question. So, mom and dad, whether he was there or not, that's absolutely someone that law enforcement should be looking at, not in terms of charging necessarily, but what did they know? And were they complicit in this?
The conversation that he had with Kessler as he was investigating the death of Cummings here, and comes to a point where he tells Kessler that he doesn't believe her, and she indicates that maybe it's time that I speak to a lawyer. Of course, it's everyone's right to speak to a lawyer if they're being questioned by law enforcement. But at that point, what do you think it projects to that detective as to Kessler being a suspect in that murder?
Well, I think she was a suspect, but ultimately she wasn't under arrest, so those Miranda rights, don't necessarily apply. But ultimately, the question is, under the Fifth Amendment, it wasn't an unequivocal request for an attorney. She said, maybe I should talk to a lawyer. So obviously, this is all part of the suppression motion that's going to be filed by the defense, if it hasn't already, to try to get this evidence out. But I mean, that's just a bad statement. Obviously, there's blood at the workplace. There's evidence of a struggle, and for you to tell law enforcement that you rode a bike into a tree when you're a suspect, or at least a person of interest, is probably not a good play if you're a defendant here.
Absolutely. And if this is a case where there is no body, so Joleen Cummings' body has not been found, hasn't been discovered. There are forensic trace evidence here in terms of the blood that was found in the salon. We have the car that was owned by Cummings being driven by Kessler. It's a circumstantial case, but seemingly a strong circumstantial case. Neama, what does the defense have to do? We've sort of talked about the prosecution side. What do you think that the defense will put forward in terms of a theory of defense as to why this jury should acquit their client?
Now, Imran, many years ago, these no-body murder cases were challenging, but now with all of this new electronic evidence and so forth, they're a lot easier to prove. I think prosecutors are a lot better handling this case. Assuming for the moment that Kessler is going to cooperate with her attorneys and assist in her defense, I think what you have to do if you're the defense is use those suppression motions, try to knock out a lot of this evidence. It's never good when your client is driving the victim's car. I mean, that's always bad. Same thing with the kind of cell phone evidence. So that's really bad. Pretty strong circumstantial case here. But if you can get evidence suppressed, there's an unlawful stop, seizure, those types of things, that tends to bode well for the defense. I don't think it's going to work here because, frankly, I don't think this client is going to be in any way cooperative during the course of trial. So we'll see what happens. Maybe she gets her act together.